let's get started with some geopolitical questions. And
Yes.
we had new elections in the European Union. At the same time, we have a new rhetoric coming out of the European Union toward Russia, and they want to fight Russia. Do you think that we're getting toward new escalations between Europe, especially between Europe and Russia? How do you see the current situation?
Well, I see the situation in Europe as really undergoing some kind of transition at this point. I think we don't know what the elections in France are going to show, since Macron is obviously trying, it looks to me, desperately to save his party from really a complete and utter defeat. And it seems to me that there's a lot of politics to play out in Europe, because one thing that is evident is that there's a large percentage of the population who might be called the non-political elite or the non-political class, who are not at all happy with what they are seeing. And it appears that they are beginning to understand something about what is actually going on. The reason I say this is in the United States here, I don't think the average person who's intelligent and interested in the news and reads the papers has yet to understand what is going on, because the papers have done, I guess, from a perspective of the Biden administration, such a good job shielding the population from the actual facts of what is going on in Ukraine. But in Europe, it looks like people are beginning to pick up on that. And so I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, but I'm also not sure what the European Parliament elections are really showing, because I do think there are things that are going to play out in ways that are unpredictable. Putin had an important meeting with his war cabinet, and it sounds plausible to me that the Russians are now rethinking what they want to do. I mean, they're looking at the European situation, they're looking at the military situation in Ukraine, they're looking at the skepticism growing in the Western European population. And it's not clear to me what they are going to do, but I would not be surprised to see if the pace of an offensive, which has so far been very effective in terms of destroying the Ukrainian army, but is not focused on taking large amounts of territory, if that may shift. Because, I don't know, but if the Russians start taking significant amounts of territory, which they are very well positioned to do, then even the American public it'll be hard to hide this from even the American public. So, it's again hard to know. The political leadership in the West is so out of touch with such basic realities that it's very hard for me to predict what they could do. For example, these constant and really delusional and reckless attempts to, quote, escalate, unquote. They have no escalation options. They only have options that run the risk of pushing the Russians into doing something that could broaden the war. I mean, that's not an escalation that helps anybody, even including the West. I mean, they can't do any damage to Russia at a level that could affect the outcome in the battlefield at this point. They just don't have the resources, military or otherwise. And all they appear to be doing is trying to see if they can poke the Russians and cause the Russians to do something that's not very wise. And my own guess, based on having watched Mr. Putin with very great care, as well as his cabinet, because his cabinet, although I don't agree with many of the things that are said by individuals, there are many people saying quite sensible and responsible things. I mean, Lavrov is the picture of rationality. Medvedev is also, he's tougher, but, looks very sensible and, in charge. And of course, Putin is extremely sensible and in charge. He certainly has some people who are more extreme than him, but he doesn't seem to let them push him into doing anything. And so I don't think any attempts to escalate, so to speak, are going to be successful. And that, of course, will be good for everybody, including those people who think that escalating would somehow help them, because they don't seem to have any idea what they're doing. It's like dealing with an infant who just throws a bigger tantrum at some point, and you just say, okay, let them jump around and until they lose energy and quiet down. That's my assessment of the situation. The parliamentary election is too small an indicator of what I think is actually going to be happening. Although I don't know what's going to. I mean, it's just one indicator of a large number of variables that are still to play out, and for us to see things happen with regard to.
Yeah, because one of the signs of escalation would be the response coming from Shoigu. He recently said, yes, Russian tactical nuclear weapons, they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons as a response to Kiev's permission to attack Russian civilian facilities.
That would be an absolutely disastrous choice on the part of the Russians. I don't want to sound like these people who dismiss this, because you should never dismiss something when a man in Shoigu's position makes a statement like that. At least maybe it's because I don't work at the White House that I don't dismiss these things. But I do think that all of the indicators I can see, certainly of Shoigu, is that he's a man of very great intellect and accomplishment, and I don't quite understand why he would choose to use nuclear weapons. If I assume why he might say this, it's harder for me to make a judgment about, simply because I don't understand how people are choosing to send messages. Maybe he has a message in mind he's trying to send. But I just don't think the Russians are going to use nuclear weapons in this situation, because the Russians are not threatened in a way that would justify nuclear weapon use based on their doctrine. They are very clear that, and it makes sense from their situation, that if they are losing a conventional war so badly that the future of the Russian state is in question, then they might use nuclear weapons. Even then, I don't think they would surely use nuclear weapons. But I guess if they reached the point where there was no doubt that they had to, I'm quite sure they would. But there's nothing close to the situation they're in now. There's no basis for them. What they could do, which would make perfect sense to me, the cost of it in casualties, if there are going to be casualties, there may not even be big casualties. What I would do in their situation, if I really felt that I had to press the West, is I unleash these 300,000 troops that are fully rested and fully trained and fully equipped, and I'd just roll over Ukraine. I'd be in Kiev in probably weeks, it sounds easy to talk about in an armchair, but I think I can't imagine that the Ukrainian forces could slow up a serious Russian advance at this point, given the Ukrainian situation. They're losing 1,500 soldiers a day. I mean, it's extraordinary, the losses they're taking. And they've already lost God knows how many people, easily 500,000. The army is filled with conscripts who are don't want to be there. And all I can think of is if I knew a young person who was Ukrainian, I'd be beside myself that they were putting this person out there. They're just being put out there to be slaughtered. It's the most. It angers me because you have an obligation to your citizens not to just murder them. Why don't you just kill them on the streets? That's very little difference here. And why are they doing this? They're doing this because the Americans want them to do this, and they also want to see if they can remain in power in some way. And it's no different than Hitler, putting out young children in Berlin to fight the Russian army as it storms into Berlin. It's just murderous for your own people. It's just destroying your own country. And I just cannot, I mean, I'm beside myself with distress seeing the Ukrainian government do this to its people. But if I were Russian, I mean, the Russians don't have a choice. And from their point of view, they want to end this war. And they want NATO not to be on their border. And if I were Putin and had doubts in my mind about whether the special military operation was an appropriate choice, I don't think I'd have many doubts now, because it's clear that the intent of NATO expansion through Ukraine was to damage Russia. There's very little question at this point that this, when the history of this is written, we'll know more and more detail, and we will know, we will know it with even less uncertainty than we know it now. But it's absolutely clear that the intent of NATO expansion was to damage Russia. And so, as far as I can tell, the special military operation, however awful it was, I mean, it's awful in terms of the lives of Russians and Ukrainians lost, it was justified because in some way or other, this NATO expansion was a threat to the future of Russia. It really was. I mean, NATO has proven it. You could make a moral argument, I guess, that Putin may not have known that at the time he finally decided to go in. That's an argument that's for philosophy, not for me, at least. I'd be interested to hear it, but I don't know if I could add much to that argument. But there's very little doubt when you look at the historical concerns of Russia, like any country that wants to survive, that there was a threat that was definitely intended to take Russia down, to destroy Russia, to even not just to take the government down, but to cause it to break up into these little states, and which to me is delusionary. I mean, it's the same kind of delusions that have gone on for 100, 200 years in Europe. I mean, Russia is a giant state. It's a state that is made up of many components. It's a multi-ethnic state, although dominantly Russian. Unlike Ukraine, it has dealt with its multi-ethnic character in a way that has allowed it to remain cohesive. So for Biden to sit there and look at this guy Zelensky on the D-Day memorial celebration and talk about democracy, it sickens me. It really does sicken me, because I do think that D-Day was a military event that did greatly contribute to stopping something that was profoundly evil. No question in my mind. And maybe I'm wrong, but that's the way I feel. But then to compare this man Zelensky, who's murdering his people brutally, to a great democratic leader, and you have these men sitting there, they're near 100 years old, who fought there, and to use these men as foils to aggrandize your own political ambition to get reelected president, which is really what was going on, it sickens me. It really does disgust me. And so it's a complicated situation, and everybody perhaps has some blame to take in this, but it certainly, when I look at placing blame, it's squarely on these people in the White House right now. And there's no question in my mind that these people are murdering all kinds of people. They're criminals. They're war criminals. That's what's happening here, And when you, I really haven't followed the Gaza thing very carefully, but when you make believe you're trying to stop a murderous situation in Gaza and you never step in, you're sending the weapons in without abatement. It's hard to sit there as an observer, whether you're an American citizen. I mean, I just want to scream, not in my name. I just want to say, not in my name. This is not in my name. I do not approve of this. And if I could do anything about it, I would. That's the way I feel about it. I'm ashamed for what is happening here for my country. And I don't not love my country. I love my country deeply. I really do. I love the United States. So that's, it's far from the parliamentary election we got, but anyway. So.
The problem is, you talk about D-Day, they just removed Russia from D-Day, and what are you doing? Russia was a huge part of D-Day.
How do you take a country that in reality won the war with the fight in the East? They lost 20 million or more people. They fought valiantly. How do you take a country, so I don't agree with you. I'm not going to not invite you to a great historical celebration. Instead, I invite this, I'm sorry to say it, this punk, this delusionary punk from Ukraine, and I call him, great democratic leader, even though I know or should know he's murdering his own people. To me, in fact, I have a joke with the American soldiers I know, because most other Americans wouldn't know, is I say, I like to celebrate the date of June 25, 1944, because June 25, 1944 was when the Cobra breakout occurred. This was when the Americans and the Allies successfully broke the German defensive lines that had them bottled up on the peninsula, and just swept into France in an unstoppable wave. It was just amazing. I mean, it was just the war. They just exploded into what was held by Germany. Right, it was June 44, and less than a year later, it was over. In April, the end of April of 45, Hitler shot himself. And incidentally, my birthday is the same day that Hitler killed himself.
That's amazing.
I have a friend who was born on May 12th, and my joke with him is, I'm ahead of you because my birthday is the day that Hitler killed himself, and your day is the day that Himmler killed himself. But these people were evil. These people, it's too simple-minded to simply call certain people evil. But these people qualified for that,
Yeah.
But to exclude Russia from this remarkable event in history, it's unconscionable. It's unconscionable. It's like taking a great hero in your country and saying, I don't really agree with his politics, so I'm not going to give him credit for having been a great hero. I'm just going to say, well, I don't like you. I don't like your politics. So even though you fought for my country and did brave things and maybe were wounded, and I'm just not going to give you credit for it. I just don't see that as right. And I have plenty of friends. I mean, I tend to be on the political liberal side, left of center politically. And many of my friends are right of center, many of them. They're soldiers in the American system. They tend to be considerably right of center. But I don't value them any less as friends. I mean, I would never ever try to take credit for them for their take away credit from them for their contributions to my country. I see them as loyal citizens who I have some disagreements with. We all basically agree on the same things, the most important things. So, they have some socially different ideas about social, mechanisms than I would do. But, big deal. That's not a reason to end a friendship. It's a reason to nurture the friendships because you talk about these things, you learn from each other. Because their ideas, even though I may not agree with all of them, are not based on nonsense. So I'm always learning. I have a good friend. I'm in Nebraska now. And I just spent the whole day yesterday with a friend of mine who owns a big farm. He's a farmer, and I'm an academic. I mean, that's how different can you get? And we had a wonderful time together, and he has a very different perspective on a lot of things. And I learned a boatload from him in our discussions. We didn't get angry at each other. We didn't, we enjoy each other. I give him a hard time about mad cow disease or something, joke with him. And he jokes with me about, not being able to tell a tractor from a combine or something like that. So what? That's having friends with different backgrounds and views is great.
Yeah.
So
Just getting to the conflict in Ukraine, and recently we had a drone attack on a radar site in Russia. And
yes.
how did you find this attack, and why did it happen, and why the Ukrainian were doing this, and why the Ukrainian did this? What's the importance of this, in your opinion?
Well, it's hard for me to know because uh, the speculations, are, for example, there's a speculation that the White House knew about this. I don't know. I think it's possible. The reason I think it's possible is because the people in the White House know so little, and they probably didn't understand. If they knew, they probably didn't understand what a grave danger of an accidental escalation to a nuclear war, not a decision to use a tactical nuclear weapon, but an accident that leads to massive launches of strategic forces, how, the possibility of such a thing increases. Now, it's not like the Russians are sitting there with their fingers on the button and they're going to launch everything all at once. But we know from past experience that extremely improbable things can happen that you would never guess about. You wouldn't even. I've thought about. I've been worried about accidental nuclear war all of my career. It's really my whole career was centered in one way or another on that issue. And the things that I have learned about over time where accidents have occurred, were I couldn't imagine them. I didn't imagine them. And now, what the average, well, more than the what the average political leader doesn't know, which is important for them to know. Any political leader who doesn't know this after these situations should be thrown out of office as far as I'm concerned, is that the Russians do not have a space-based early warning system, satellites, that can see the entire world. Now, why is that important? Imagine I have a radar with, and I'll show some diagrams just to help people visualize things. Imagine I have a radar that looks out along a given path, azimuth. And I'll show shortly that the radar cannot see what's going on the surface of the Earth. It can only see missiles after the missiles rise into the radar fan, search fan. And it's like if someone was behind a building and you had a searchlight and you were using the searchlight and searching along one of the edges of the building, you couldn't see them until they step out and get illuminated by the searchlight. So that's the Earth is round, it's curved. And so the radar can see things coming in, but it delayed in time relative to something that can see this thing as soon as it starts firing its rocket motors from the Earth's surface or the ocean surface. Now, this somewhat what would seem a minor thing, understandably to a person who hasn't been thinking about these things, is what would happen if I lost a radar and I was in the United States where we have this capability, is I would simply say, well, let's go look at what's happening in the North Atlantic now. Let's take look at the satellites. Now, I would have no way of knowing, if I only had a radar, whether there was an attack underway from the North Atlantic. But if I look at the satellite, I can see if there's something happening in the North Atlantic. And if I see something, let's say I see evidence of a launch of a couple of missiles. Well, that's not that's not consistent with a serious attack. I mean, unless you have reason to believe that an adversary would do such a thing and would be so crazy to attack your country that way. So I might then say, well, this doesn't look right. Maybe there's a false signal. Maybe that we're seeing something that's not right. Incidentally, this kind of thing has happened. And so I would say, well, let's look at the Pacific, because these guys have submarines in the Pacific as well as in the North Atlantic. And if they're serious about attacking us, there's going to be things coming out of the Pacific. And then I look and I see, oh, there's nothing coming out of the Pacific. Well, I'm still on alert, but I'm not alerting my nuclear forces and readying them to launch because I think they're going to be brought under attack. I have a better sense of what's going on. Now, the Russians don't have this wonderful capability. Now, people find this implausible. And you need to know a little bit about technology, and you need to have done a little homework on this problem. And I've done a little bit, much more than a little homework on it, and I can share some of what we do know and explain what we know and what we don't know, because this is a significant problem. Why don't I turn on the share here? And I'm going to pull up a bunch of slides. And let me just start by showing you what the Russian early warning system looks like. Can you all see this?
Yeah.
Okay. And basically, there are 10 radars. The radars have a radar screen that looks out in different directions. And they cover 360 degrees of azimuth. So there's no way for the United States or anybody else to attack Russia without the Russians seeing eventually through their radars something coming in. And they would also, incidentally, they would not only see something coming in, they would know where it came from, because the laws of gravitation and orbital motion would tell you that this thing is coming from, let's say, Ecuador rather than the United States, or Greenland rather than North America, or whatever. There would be no, so not only would the Russians know they're under attack, they would have a good guess, a good rough information about where the missile was coming from. So that would be a good thing. So let me just get this. Sorry. Now, this is the worst situation I could possibly have here with this Zoom. All right, so let me just jump down for a little ways, and so in the case of the United States, we have these satellites that look straight down at the Earth. Now, you might say, well, why are they not able to look straight down? Well, the answer, the details, of course, are very complicated. And incidentally, for those people who really wanted to know, I could go through the details because I have gone through the details over the years. Basically, if you look straight down at the Earth, let's look at here. I have a certain resolution when I look at the ground. So let's imagine I have a single sensor that measures the brightness of what I see in a given area. Maybe this is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer on a side. So this is a million square meters of Earth surface, and there are clouds, and there's ground below it, which is also reflecting sunlight. And maybe there's a missile in this area. And the missile has a very bright exhaust plume, because what I'm looking at is the rocket motor exhaust plume of the missile. But the signal from that exhaust plume is small relative to the tremendously bright reflected signal from reflections off the clouds and the ground. Well, one way I can make the reflected signal small or smaller is I can look into a smaller area of ground, which I'm just sort of cartoon showing here. So now the amount of reflected sunlight from the Earth is much smaller, but I still have to, it's still significant. So what I would have to do is I would look twice maybe, and subtract 1 frame from the other and say, this missile has flown to another frame, so this frame is no longer bright. And what other frame next to it is bright? So I look all around and I say, there's a frame here that's bright. And the distance between this frame and that frame is roughly what I expect if it's a missile in powered flight. So if I saw a bright light here and I look all around and I don't see a bright light later, then I say, well, that's a false alert. Or so maybe it's a mountaintop that gave me a false reflection, or there's clouds were moving, or lightning, or something. Because so what do I need to be able to look down then? Well, first of all, I need to be able to look simultaneously into a very large number of small areas. But that means I need a sensor that has many, many, many pixels. If it's an infrared sensor, it has to be made of many pixels. Now, if I look at the scientific literature in Russia, so we're talking scientific literature, the Russians have had a very difficult time. Their solid-state electronic industry has, for reasons of historical accident, never developed into what it should be, given the extraordinary technical capability Russia is in other areas. So we all have in the West, we found ourselves unable to manufacture artillery shells at nearly the same level as the Russians. So each of these extraordinary enterprises have their own strengths and weaknesses. Unfortunately for Russia, the solid-state electronics technology did not develop very well in Russia. There are reasons for it that we could talk about, but that's not important. It didn't because of all kinds of historical accidents in Russia, not because of the science. I want to be clear. The science is superb in Russia. I've worked with the scientists who are involved in early warning in Russia. So I know some of these people. These people are at the top of their scientific capabilities. They just don't have the technical instruments. So one of the problems they have is they have very small infrared sensors, infrared array sensors. What do I mean by that? The infrared sensor has a physical size, and the sensor is made up of many independent pixels, each of which can look into an area of ground independently. And a typical very advanced sensor that the Russians are now building has about 10,000 elements in it. And for reasons I could go, and typically 1,000 of those elements would be sweeping over an area at a given time. Well, that's not terrible. That's pretty good. But if you compare that to the numbers of sensors that the United States has in its satellite, the space-based infrared system, our sensors have 16 million sensors. So if you want to get a feeling for what that means, imagine this screen you're looking at was a television screen of a high-definition television. And I had this view of the Earth. And up here now, you have this view of the Earth. If you can see you have such a small sensor, you can only see this much of the Earth simultaneously. So the only way you can do things is sweep it along over time. And you can do much less. And that's unfortunately what the Russian technical situation is. They don't have not only the sensor, but the computational in-space computational capabilities on the satellite to subtract the backgrounds, to look at these other things, subtract the backgrounds around here, see if we can find a track because there are false alarms everywhere. And that requires enormous computational capability along with, of course, enormously sophisticated infrared sensors with very large numbers of elements. Well, the technology is not available in Russia. And in fact, I have letters I can send. I was actually going to, as I mentioned to you in a note, I've been talking with Andrei Martyanov, and I'll be sending him some things just to show him what I was trying to do when I discovered this was the situation, because I was working with Russian people in Russia's Cometa, their early warning space-based system corporation, because I was trying to work with a joint program, a U.S.-American program with infrared technology, and of course my country reneged on the agreement. And that failed. And I have letter upon letter upon letter to people where I tried to get the United States to meet its commitments. But unfortunately, we all know, whether we're Americans or not, if we're being honest, that the United States is not good on keeping its commitments. But if we look at what the United States can do, because it can look down and deal with these tremendously bright backgrounds, is if you have 3 or more satellites, you can cover the entire Earth. You don't need 9, 10, 12 satellites to do that, which of course is one of the reasons why one of the indicators I immediately got when I started looking at the Russian satellite system. They were using 8 and 9 satellites in different constellations. And I'm sometimes like, why are the Russians using so many satellites? What's going on here? And that got me thinking about what was actually happening. And through a series of remarkable guesses and analyses, we discovered that the Russians did not have this ability to look down. And so if you look at the Earth today, so this is a Mercator projection. So one of the satellites looks here, another satellite looks here, the third satellite looks here. We cover basically the entire Earth. The only places we don't cover are the northern areas where we do have special satellites that look at those areas, but we don't have a lot of them. We don't need a lot. If we look at what the Russians have been doing, their space-based system essentially looks at the Earth here. Maybe it's little. They can see the northern tier of the United States. So why do they not look straight down? Well, we know why they look straight down. What they have, and this is, I want to underscore, this was an extremely intelligent and clever thing to do when you don't have the technology to do what you really would like to do. It's not that they were foolish or silly. They said we're unable to implement this much more. Let's see what we can do. So what they did is, at the time that when they started doing this, the most advanced and most dangerous threat to Russia was the ICBMs that were on the northern tier of the United States. That's what was the big problem. They started launching satellites in 1970. So their effort for early warning is over 50 years old. So when somebody says, as some people have said, well, they're not worried about early warning, you say, what are you talking about? Why would they spend 50 years launching satellites into these orbits if they didn't think it was important? It's expensive to launch satellites. It's not. So they launched these satellites into what are called Molniya orbits. A Molniya orbit takes about 12 hours to complete. It's at the lowest altitude, called the perigee. It's about 600 kilometers from the Earth's surface. At the highest altitude, it's about 40,000 kilometers. What I've shown in this cartoon is the locations of a satellite in 1 hour intervals. So what you can see, like here's 4 to 8 hours, it whips very fast around the Earth because it's going very fast and slow. And then as it rises, it's like throwing a ball vertical. It tends to sit at the top of the trajectory, moving slowly. And from that location, it turns out if you have 9 or 10 of these satellites, so they had a constellation with 9 or 10 satellites, and 2.5 hours a day when the satellite constellation was full with 9 satellites, 2.5 hours a day, one of the 9 satellites would be in a location to look down at the Earth at a glancing angle. So here's the satellite, and it's looking at a glancing angle at the Earth. And the reason it's looking at a glancing angle is it can see the missile against the background of space is black. There's not a lot of light coming from it. So you can see the missile against the black background of space. The problem is, here's an example. This is just showing you a 9 satellite constellation. It's not showing you the actual locations in time, but the satellites would be spaced out, how they would be spaced out. And you can see here the beam is looking at the edge of the Earth. Sometimes that's called the Earth limb. And you can also note that if you're forward or back of the actual area that you would be seeing at the edge, the missile will not be observable because you'll see reflections from the ground. So that's what limits. So one way to think of it, if you remember your geometry, if you take a plane and you pass it through a sphere, you have a circular area on the ground on the sphere. And that's basically what you have. And once that circle gets so large that the curvature, you cannot see a missile in powered flight against, you're looking against the background, you can't see it. And the other problem you have is that when the missile is at higher altitude, it's not nearly as bright as it is at lower altitude. So the Russians had a lot of problems to solve because the missiles have to be high enough at altitude to be seen, and they also have to be bright enough, given that their brightness is very small. So anyway, we don't need to go through, but this is really what the area of the satellites look like. So, so you might ask, well, how did we discover this? That's an interesting story by itself. Stop me if you think this is not an interesting story, but what happened is there was a dog that didn't bark. This is like a mystery story. Why didn't that dog bark when there was this, when there was this burglary going on? And that's what got me onto this problem. This is a problem that started in 1996. The Russians had a situation where there was a rocket launched by scientists. This had nothing to do with anything military. It was launched to an altitude of about 11,000 kilometers. And the purpose was to measure the electrical fields and also, I think it was light in the aurora borealis in the high altitude ionosphere. And so the rocket took 11 minutes to get to this 11,000 11,000 kilometer altitude. This little red line here shows where one of the rocket stages fell, because it was a multi-stage rocket. And basically, what happened was this rocket, this trajectory, was right in the middle. This was launched in off Norway, and this rocket was flying to high altitude, right in the middle of the path from Grand Forks, North Dakota, where Minuteman ICBMs were, to Moscow. Now, so this caused an alert of the Russian early warning system. There was a radar on the Kola Peninsula at a place called Olenogorsk, and this radar observed the rocket rising. So why was there concern? Well, it turns out that the rocket had certain speed, the stage came off, and when you look at the characteristics of the staging of the rocket, it could look like a Trident ballistic missile on a near vertical trajectory. Well, why would you care about that? It's not going toward you. It's going toward the North Pole. See it here. Well, what was of concern was that if the rocket were carrying a nuclear weapon, it could explode at this high altitude, and it would create a flash of X-rays. The X-rays are just generated by the enormous heat in the fireball, and that these X-rays would ionize the ionosphere to a very high level of ionospheric density, and it would in effect be like throwing a blanket over this radar's ability to see things. So the radar would be blind. It would not be able to see anything along this area. Just would be blind. So it would just be like you took a blanket. It would be an ionized region over this radar. It would be absorbing all the radar signals. So there would be a radar signal that came up, and then there'd be no radar signal at all. So this radar would be shut down. It would, even though it might still be operating, could see nothing. So if you had an attack coming in, what you would want to do is blind this radar, because you want to delay the launch of the rocket forces of your adversary. You're hoping to catch them on the ground and destroy them. If this sounds a little crazy, you're right. I mean, if that's your reaction. But this is what people, who think about winning nuclear wars, this is what they think about. And this is what the United States and actually the Soviet Union at one time were also thinking. So now I have this little blanket over the radar. It can't see anything. So now these missiles coming in will not be seen at all until they happen to be seen, until they arrive on their target, which in this particular depiction would be Moscow, but it would be lots of other places. Now, at the time this particular incident occurred, Russia had, this was 1996. It was Yeltsin was in power. Russia was in an economic collapse. Russia had early warning radars, but some of these radars were not finished. It was a radar at, I never get it right, Baranovichi, that was never completed. ICBMs, American ICBMs, they were the most capable missiles the Americans had. By 1996, the most capable missiles the Americans had were Trident submarine missiles. The Tridents were more accurate and had high-yield nuclear weapons, and they could do more damage to Russian military forces than the US ICBMs could. And they were in the North Atlantic and the Gulf of Alaska. And the Russians had not completed radars, and they had these zero warning attack corridors into Russia where they could not see with a radar whether or not they were under attack, and they had no satellites. This was a very dangerous period. I remember I was in Russia, and at that time we were supposed to be working to be friends. Yeltsin and Clinton were in power, and I was working as hard as I could to improve cooperation between the United States and Russia. And so I was in and out of Russia all the time. I remember sitting down with this one Russian guy. He was a high-level person in their radar early warning system, and he was furious. And he, understandably, I was just an American. He didn't know what my motives were. I had just been shoved into this room with him, and he wanted to kill me. And he's talking about, he said, we had a radar at Skrunda. Skrunda, I think it was in Latvia. I think he says, you Americans made us take it down because the Latvians didn't want it. Because Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania were no longer a part of the Soviet Union. And, to me, and it was very interesting to me, years later, I was in a meeting with an ambassador, American ambassador, who's a very good man. And he was at the Skrunda taking down of the Skrunda radar celebration of taking this radar down. And he was told, he's an American ambassador, he was, I think, from Norway, to Norway, and everybody was celebrating the freedom for the Latvians. They don't have to deal with these damn Russians. Of course, my reaction to it, and I told him, and he understood what I was saying because he hadn't been told. So you realize that we were cutting a hole in the early warning system of Russia. So this ambassador learned from me, not from his American intelligence support, not from the American government. He learned from me that he had inadvertently been participating in an extremely dangerous activity where Russia was being denied important information that would assure them they were not under attack. Now, keep in mind that he learned about this after this incident, years after this incident, where the Russians saw this this rocket going into this highly elliptical orbit, this highly elliptical orbit toward the North Pole. So they had no satellites to tell them what was going on in the North Atlantic. So they had no choice but to watch this in the expectation that it might be an attack, that there might be an explosion suddenly happening, and then their radars would be blacked out, and they would know at that point that they should alert their forces to launch. And I talked with one of the officers who was in charge of that alert, of looking at the alert. And he told me that, they weren't especially concerned, even though in the United States, all kinds of people want to make certain, oh, the Russians were drunk, they were ready to do this, they were going to, and it struck me that the Russians were much more calm and professional than what the Americans, because the Russians went from 10 feet tall to 1 foot tall, drinking vodka, drunk at their, these very simple-minded ways of thinking of other people. And I knew enough Russian military officers to know that these guys were serious. They knew what they were, and that, of course, made me comfortable. And so it was Victor Yeltsin. Victor Yeltsin was commander of the Strategic Rocket Forces at the time, and very capable, trained as an engineer, also a military officer. And he said, well, I was concerned, but, I didn't think there was going to be, an attack. The situation between the United States and Russia was very good. Clinton and Yeltsin were getting on. And, but of course, we had to be concerned. And the moment this thing reached its high altitude and started to fall back to the ground, and there was no nuclear explosion that would blind our radars, he called the alert off. But as I always say to Americans who agree with me that this is a problem, I say you don't have to make a false case that this was almost an accidental nuclear attack by Russia. It's enough that it could have happened. If it had happened at a time where the United States and Russia were at each other, the outcome could have been different. That's the important point. This is the discussion that Andrei Martyanov and I are having. See, his position, which I honestly, I'm not quite sure I agree with him, but I don't strongly do. Andrei thinks that a lot of this attack was overstated. The attack on the radars was overstated. My position is that the fact that someone tried to attack the radars, even if they failed, that's enough to cause a major concern inside the system where people have the job of making sure they can respond to a nuclear attack. These people who do this, and I've known the American side and the Russian side, and quite frankly, I know very good people on the American side, but if you asked me to vote for which I would have more confidence, and I'd actually vote on the Russian side. I think the Russians, really impressive, the soldiers I met. They're all engineers, they're all soldiers, they're very capable. I'm amazed by these guys. And, they're not crazy. They don't want to see their country destroyed. They want to make sure that nobody gets the idea they can get away with it. And because nobody thinks they can get away with attacking Russia, they won't attack Russia. So if you start attacking these radars or even try to attack them, this is going to cause immense concern. So my attitude is I don't care whether these radars were significantly damaged or not. Actually, I do believe, I've been re-examining some of the images, and I do think they were the radars at Armavir was significantly damaged. I don't know if they got it up and running immediately or not. That's another discussion, but I think it was significantly damaged. But what if I'm wrong? That doesn't matter. What matters is they tried to do this. And damn it, my attitude is you don't mess with these things. This is like going in to the room where someone's infants are sleeping and making believe that you might murder them. People are not going to take that lightly. Nobody is going to take that lightly. And so I think this was an extraordinarily dangerous thing to do. And I think we could have gotten into very, very deep trouble over this. but fortunately we didn't. So anyway, so that's, I think, a very short and curtailed view of what actually might have been going on. And I don't know if I need to go into any more detail. I can, of course. I should make it, if you should correct me if I'm wrong. I think you agreed that you would put these slides up on Google Drive for people to download them.
I'm gonna put it in the description, the link to these slides, and they're gonna
Okay, so
click
I will
on that
send
link
you.
and download these slides.
Yeah, and I will send you, and actually, I have a slightly enhanced version of this, which with slightly more slides that will tell a little bit more of the story, and that'll be available to any of your audience who's wants to waste a few hours looking at them. Okay. So,
Okay.
but this is a serious matter.
Yeah.
You can't go into somebody's to their home where their infants are sleeping and into the bedroom of the infants and make believe you're going to kill them, but don't do anything and not expect a reaction. I mean, it's just, and that's what it is. That's I think a reasonable analogy. With regard to, if I always look for things that will get people's emotions, relate to people's emotions that are not I don't want to be misleading, oversimple, but I want to find a visceral way to tell people why this is not a simple, this is not just a couple of clowns fooling around on a street corner. This is very serious, very dangerous. And I hope that they got the message at the White House. But I can't say for sure because these guys, they know everything. I've dealt with a few of them at different times, and the switch is never on receive. It's always on transmit. It's amazing to me. And they will insult you. I mean, I had one guy, his name is Colin Cold. I like to use names because I want people to know who these people are. And I wrote an article, which can also be made available if people are interested, that technically, in detail, but for a non-specialist audience, I want to underscore that showed that in 2009, the United States violated the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. 2009, the United States violated the treaty. We put this system called Aegis ashore into Poland and Romania, and this was a direct violation of the INF treaty. And the Russians were talking about it immediately. So I write this article. I'm at Stanford at the time, and this punk, he's up there while I'm in an audience during another seminar, and he makes this really nasty comment about people not knowing what they're talking about. He's obviously referring to this article I wrote, and I try to carry on a civil discussion no matter what. So after the seminar, I come over to him because I want to. I said, we ought to discuss this. If you think this is true, I'd be happy to, explain this to you. And he says that this guy said, I want to be clear. This is exactly what he said. He says, I have a real job. I don't have time to talk to you. And he turns around and walks away from me. Colin called. Who's Deputy Secretary of Defense. Now, this guy is still around Stanford. They still have him in the center there. He's still talking to students. So what is a Stanford student learning from this guy? I mean, this is academic malpractice to have someone like this in a university, allowing him to go around making these outrageous claims, if he had to stand up in front of a real informed audience, he'd be crushed. But instead, he insults someone who actually knows something, who has much more experience than him. I mean, but I wasn't going to say, I didn't go and say, I have much more experience than you, I'm a big shot. I said, I know something about this. I wrote this detailed article. I can be happy to explain it to you. Nah, I'm too busy. I have a real job. Turns around and walks away. This is an example. Mike McFall, he's another guy at this place. I'm talking to him, and he doesn't even know, this was a few months ago now, he doesn't even know that Avdiivka had just fallen, and that there was that the poor Ukrainian soldiers were dropping their weapons and running. And he's talking there about, well, if we send a few more artillery pieces and we give them a little bit more money, they'll win the war. And I said to him, do you understand that? I literally said, do you understand that 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers are already casualties? And he said to me, I just sort of said this when he was speaking, and he said, "Are you attacking me?" That was his reaction. "Are you attacking me?" I said, "No, I'm giving you a fact. That's a seminar. This is, this guy is talking in a seminar, and I make this statement, and his reaction is not, 'Wow, I didn't know that. Can you?' Or I know differently. It was, 'Are you attacking me?' This is the kind of, he's for democracy. If you know Mr. McFall, he really, he's a big man. He wants democracy everywhere, but here you're in an academic situation where free discussion is supposed to be really encouraged. And you can't even inject a fact that shows he has no idea what he's talking about. I didn't say you don't know what you're talking about. I said, you understand that these 500,000 casualties, and his reaction was not, gee, or I have a different, I don't believe that. If he said that, well, okay, I think he doesn't know what he's doing, but that's another but not only does he not know it, he sees it as an attack, just giving him information that, so this is the environment in a lot of academic institutions. Stanford is just it's a dumping ground right now. There's nothing to offer, nothing. So, well, it does have, it has a wonderful scholar, my friend David Holloway. He's a historian of Russia. Fantastic person. He produces this wonderful work, but the center there is like, it's a joke. I couldn't believe it when I walked in there and started listening to the things that were being said. It's like nobody there, they're all political scientists, but they're not John Mearsheimer's. They're theorists, they're worried about the prisoner's dilemma. If you have two people in a room and I said, I had this joke, which they hates me, the center director hates me because of this joke. I used to say, if there are no prisoners, there are no dilemmas. Yeah, you think you can understand international security by understanding these logical games. Now, there's nothing wrong with studying the logical games. I understand there's a utility, there's a mathematical logic utility in understanding, these dilemmas that can be posed in the form of call them prisoners' dilemmas or whatever. But that doesn't tell you anything about the real situation. Who's to say that you and I have the same values and see the world the same way and value the same things and are afraid of the same? If you don't know that I don't have any early warning system, you might think you can poke me in a way that will, serve your purpose of just getting my attention without causing me to explode into a nuclear attack. You need to know facts. And these guys think you can do political science without knowing facts. Now, I have great respect for those who do political science, looking at the facts. To me, the great example is John Mearsheimer. I really admire. But I know other people. Barry Posen is another guy who's tremendously capable at this, but these guys at Stanford, it's like going into a netherworld. I don't know, so I don't go to the center, and nobody else knows. It's interesting. I was at the center 40 years ago. Incidentally, I wasn't invited to the 40-year celebration, even though I was one of the founders. But I have some sympathy with Russians. It was a lively place. We had Russians there and Chinese there and Japanese soldiers and diplomats and, English and Germans. And now it's just a group of characters who are, I call them Clintonistas. They're clones of Hillary Clinton. And anybody who looks at Hillary Clinton would say, well, there is a woman of great intelligence. There's no question she is great intelligence. But personality matters. Your attitude toward the world matters as much as intelligence. And if you think you know everything, you're incapable of learning, even if you have the capacity in the little storage cells. And if you don't respect the possibility that other people have views and ideas that are inconsistent with yours, where you might learn something from them, actually, if you just engage with them, you are going to be functionally illiterate. And she is a person, if you look at her from that perspective, you realize how dangerous this woman was and is. So this guy Sullivan, he's a Clintonista. Blinken, he's a Clintonista. You look at the way they operate. These guys know it all. They know it. But, they're not, if you give them a problem, add 2 and 2, as long as they're dealing with the numbers, and, they'll find out the number is 3 and be pretty confident that they got it right. And if you say, well, maybe it's not 3, they'll just ignore you, because they know they're smarter than everybody else. So the personality and characteristics of an individual is ultimately as important as the intellectual capacity. By that I mean the capacity to pick up certain pieces of information, store them, and logically manipulate them. And if you don't have an openness to, if your bay of knowledge is not open to the ocean, and you're not accepting things that are different from what you believe at a given moment, you're effectively an idiot. And if I look at my own evolution over decades, I know, I'm much more knowledgeable now than I was when I was younger. I'm slower because I'm older. I don't have, but I have much less confidence in my knowledge than I used to have. When I was younger, I was pretty sure that I knew what was going on. And I wasn't always wrong, but I wasn't always right either. And now, I still understand. Now I'm actually much less sure that I know what's going on, because I realize there's a lot of complexity in the world that I don't have a clue about. And but if you think you know it, you're going to screw it up every time. And if you look at the decision making in this White House, you decide you're going to impose sanctions on Russia. Did you go and ask an international economist what the issues are with sanctions? That sanctions have some blowback, that you can damage your own economies. Now they're gearing up to impose sanctions on China. Do you know that China has 3 times the manufacturing capacity of the United States? 3 times. I mean, and Americans, the American economy is benefiting from all these products. They're supposedly underselling us. They're subsidizing it. Well, maybe they're not subsidizing. Maybe they just have a more efficient form of capitalism. Because I think of China as a capitalist country that is strongly managed by the government, and the government management knows what it's doing. That is to say, it doesn't have a bunch of clowns who gave to the Democratic or Republican Party become the Secretary of Labor, because they were the right people, because they were good Democrats or good Republicans. They have real professionals in there. Now, we could talk about issues of democratic process and autocracy. Those are real issues. But if the most important issue is to first make sure your people are taken care of, they're doing a great job. Fantastic job. And it's certainly, we are in the United States, we're tremendously wealthy. We are not doing as good a job for our people. I mean, I'm in great shape. I have anything I want to do. I have enough money to do it. I can do what I want. I'm a free person. And, I always talk, when I talk to a young person, I say, you shouldn't spend your life grubbing for money, but at the same time, you want enough money because it's freedom. You don't have to drive a fancy car. I don't drive a fancy car. If you like a fancy car, it makes you feel good. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying you shouldn't, if you have the resource, but I don't think it's important. I just want a car that's safe and reliable. That's my priority. But the thing that makes you free with money is you can exercise choices, and you can do things like help other people. I have people, my wife and I have people, we see they need help, we help them. Makes me feel great. They're great people, they're nice people. I don't, it makes me happy. I'm glad it makes them happy too, but it really makes me happy. That's why I enjoy it. But all this, but Americans today, there's so many Americans who don't have enough money to live on. I walk through the streets sometimes and I see some young child. I'm in a poor neighborhood. I came from a very poor background. I was very lucky. Nobody's self-made. I don't believe that at all. I was very lucky. And I see these young children, and I actually have a twinge of sadness, because I said, what are they going to face in life? They're going to be in dead-end jobs. They're going to have no sense of future. They're going to, and the luckiest of them will find a profession by accident where they're actually good enough and they at it to make a good living, which is what happened to me. And if they're happy at their job, which is the most important thing, is you have a family and you have a job. A job is important to be happy at, and you can live a good, fulfilling life. But if you hate your job, and when 4 or 5 o'clock comes around and you're out the door as fast as you can, I don't, maybe you make a lot of money. I know people make a lot of money and they can't wait to get out of their, to leave their employment area. But I don't envy them at all. I have enough that I can do what I want. Maybe if I wanted a 100-meter yacht, it would be different, and I'd be terribly unhappy about it. Although I don't understand why anybody would, but that's a different discussion.
Yeah.
But we don't take care of our people in the United States. You call that democracy? If people literally have to worry about feeding their children in a country that has so much, I'm out here in this agricultural fantasy land. See these fields of corn and soy and wheat. I mean, these people here feed the world, not the only. And you say there are people in the United States who are going hungry. It's just incredibly sad for me. And so, but so we're not, democracy is a very complicated entity. And it's certainly being able to inject a fact during an academic seminar should, at a minimum, I certainly never had trouble doing that when I was in Russia and injected a fact where it raised questions among the people who were having a discussion. I was accepted, debated, sometimes disagreed with, but it was always civil and constructive, and we learned from each other. But now what you see is in these academics, you see now they are really practicing. It's really academic misconduct. And I'm a guy. I survived. I only survived at MIT because of tenure, because I found that MIT was lying to the Senate Armed Services Committee about a very important technical matter, missile defense related. And I went public with it. I went after MIT's administration. And let me tell you, they went after me. And if I hadn't been known, world reputation scholar, I'd be gone, because they did some pretty nasty things to try to get rid of me. So the idea that tenure, you don't have to fight for it. You couldn't believe the kinds of things that these people would try to do in a system that they claimed was tenured and supposedly free from improper pressure. Get a letter from the president of the university. It's not a letter. It's an envelope, interdepartmental envelope, and it's got letters from angry MIT alumni who give big money to the university. No comments at all, just sent to me. So I go meet with the president, Charles Vest, at the time. I said, what were you intending to tell me with this envelope? He says, always just trying to keep you informed about what the administration is dealing with. We're just helping to keep you as a member of the faculty informed. I said, well, if you had added a letter saying, dear Ted, I know you're under a lot of pressure, because I was under a lot of pressure. And because this Raytheon company is the biggest employer in the state of Massachusetts, where MIT is. And I had to increase the security at my home. I had to put security into my office, because I was advised by congressional investigators that my office could be trashed. And so it was not a calm time for me, to be frank. And I said, and all this is going on while my university president, sends me this envelope filled with these ignorant attacks on my work. And I just said to him, I said, well, if you had enclosed a little letter saying, I know you're doing a public service, and I thank you for it, and the university thanks you for it, and enclose these letters along with it, I would say to myself, well, he's indicating to me that he's doing what he can to protect me and my freedom of inquiry, and also do my duty to my country. So I said to him, Chuck, we're all academics, we're on first name basis because we're such good friends. So I said, Chuck, don't you ever do that again. Because if you do, I'll make sure that it's in every newspaper I can find. And of course, that's the one thing they fear, because they are these great educators, and they're, good people, and they're above everybody else, and they're above politics, but in fact, they're not. They're just, they're CEOs of corporations, these presidents. And the corporations are big. In the case of these prestige schools, they're big requirements for resources and money. And, I had spent a lot of time trying to raise money to run my group of scientists, because I paid their salaries through grants, not the university. University didn't pay a nickel. The university took every bit of money they could get from me. And so these guys are CEOs, except they're not regulated. You know, if you're in a big corporation and you get caught lying to the Congress, something might have. Today, nothing would happen to you, but you know, there was a time where something could happen to you. At least I'll say could. Here, this guy is lying to the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I even had the letters at this point. Letters lying to the Senate Armed Services. Parlevin at the time, he's gone now, and you know, he's threatening me. You know? And who is he? He's some guy that got off the street to be the president of MIT. He wasn't even a distinguished scholar. And, you know, I wasn't going to put up with that. But, you know, academic world is filled with this kind of nonsense. And, you know, I know many people who hate academics, who hate the academic community. And, you know, I won't defend this community because the community has some extraordinary people that do wonderful things and do great services for their subject areas and for the community and the world. And then they got a lot of people who are just looking to draw attention to themselves and make claims, this guy McFall, I just can't believe him. He gets on television and he starts talking, and I say, now that I knew there was something wrong just listening to him, but then when I talked to him, I had this discussion. I just could. He didn't even say I was wrong. He didn't have a different argument. He just didn't know. He just didn't know. He had no knowledge of any kind. And at one point he actually said, "Are you threatening? Do you want me to talk about my thesis again? You know, you're asking me to defend my thesis." He literally said this. You know, you know, why don't you read one of my books? And I said, you know, I've read some of your stuff. There's nothing in it. You know, I've worked with the Russians. I don't claim to be a Russian scholar. You know, I don't claim that at all. I just worked in Russia with very, very high quality people. I was very privileged to do it. And sometimes people outside those circles who I think saw me as a problem, but I learned from them too. And I hope that they learned from me. And it's a wonderful experience. I still communicate. I just had a wonderful exchange of notes with a friend of mine in Russia. And we were both chatting about, well, not just chatting. I wrote him and said I was so sad about the war. And he wrote back to me and he said, I agree with you. This is a war that didn't have to happen. You know, we had no disagreement. So our governments, my government, I should say, his government, I think they felt like they had no choice. And I don't know if they had no choice or not, but I think the evidence that we now see is that Putin was right, that this NATO expansion was not innocent. It was aimed at damaging Russia. We know that clearly and unambiguously at this point by all the actions that have followed as this war has evolved, and by statements of people like, the American Secretary of Defense and things like that.